Involvement with the criminal justice system is life-changing. It matters.
Having a justice system that works is a really important part of a democratic society.
I'm Penelope Gibbs, Director of Transform Justice.
I'm Rob Allen. I've worked in and around criminal justice all my career.
This is the Transform Justice podcast, throwing light on the criminal justice system.
Hearing from people who know.
It's about whether the system's fair
and what can be done to make it better.
Hello. Today we're doing a special podcast on the sentencing review, commissioned by the Lord Chancellor to propose reforms to sentencing in England and Wales. Penal reformers poured all their hopes into this report, which was published on Thursday the 22nd of May. Today, Rob Allen is mainly going to answer rather than ask questions, and we're joined by Rachel Sylvester, political editor for The Observer. Rob, just first off, we've been waiting for this sentencing review for quite a while. What reflections have you got on the launch?
Well, I suppose my first thought was, although it's called a sentencing review, it's actually more about the implementation of sentences. Now, that might seem a small distinction, but Mr. Gauke identified sentence inflation as the big problem, the fact that sentences have got longer and longer over the last 10 or 15 years in the first part of his report, which he produced a few months ago. This doesn't really have anything in it about addressing that. What it does do is try to cope with the consequences.
Rachel, first reflections?
I think that's a really interesting point from Rob, and I think that's really to do with the politics, that the ministers thought they couldn't go to the House of Commons and try and get through a bill making sentences shorter across the board. So what David Gauke has done is he's come up with a workaround of how to keep the prison population down, which is by having this system of a third of the sentence in prison, a third under house arrest, and then a third on licence. But as Rob says, it stops the thing completely overflowing, but it doesn't bring it back down, nor does it actually really reduce the sentences back to what they were 30 or 40 years ago.
When the report was actually launched, the news agenda was dominated by a tiny part of it, a proposal to extend a pilot of chemical castration for those who'd committed sex offences. Was this what's called a dead cat to distract from the rest of the report?
Absolutely. So what I think the government was worried about was that this would look like a sort of soft on crime, let people out of prison, too liberal report. So I think you're right. It was a diversion, a dead cat. And I suppose you could say that's controversial, but is it a small price to pay? I think what the government's done here is actually quite brave, taking on that consensus on the right that prison works, lock them up, throw away the key, and that's the only thing that will be acceptable to the public. Actually, this is quite a liberal reforming review. Keir Starmer has backed it. Shabana Mahmood has backed it. We've had successive justice secretaries over the last 10, 20 years trying to push through reforms that would bring down the prison population. They've all been blocked by Number 10 because they were worried about the tabloid newspapers and public opinion. If now this has gone through with a bit of political cover from chemical castration, that's worth it, I'd say.
Worth it, even though it could have been an opportunity to actually start influencing that broader agenda?
Well, I think they have actually been making that case. The appointment of David Gauke, I thought, was a really smart appointment to bring in a former Conservative Justice Secretary who had himself tried to reform sentences when he was in the job and been blocked by Number 10. You can't say he's a sort of mad lefty. He's quite tough in many ways. But he then took a look at the facts and he did make a very considered argument about why we can't keep going in this direction. He talked about what he called the penal populism of the ratcheting up of sentences, politicians constantly legislating for new offences, new minimum tariffs. And he said that hasn't worked. So he did make those big arguments.
And Rob, do you think his recommendations will reduce the total predicted size of our prison population in England and Wales?
I think it will reduce the numbers, yes. Will it reduce them enough to prevent some further need for action down the line? I'm not so sure. We were both, Penelope, at a seminar earlier in the year with David Gauke, and he said there was an arithmetical imperative that there are 10,000 fewer people in prison than there otherwise would have been. And that's what he has come up with in his report. I mean, Rachel's absolutely right that by and large, Keir Starmer and Shabana Mahmood have accepted it, but they haven't accepted all of it. There are some things on the early release where they have felt that's a bridge too far. That starts to eat into the 9,800 places or something that Mr. Gauke says he will save.
But also, I mean, they have predicted the need for an extra 20,000 prison places. So this is just a reduction in the increase, isn't it?
Yes, you're right.
So this means our prison population is going to get bigger and bigger, whatever.
Yeah, this isn't kind of going soft on crime. It's moderating a little bit what has been a kind of inexorable rise in prison numbers. Could he have gone further? Should he have gone further? Should the government have accepted the recommendations in their entirety? I think yes, but they obviously took a cautious view, partly because I'm sure of the politics.
It's a bit like with the pandemic when Boris Johnson talked about squashing the sombrero, isn't it? It's about trying to bend the curve so it doesn't go inexorably up. But I suppose the really interesting question is, does it affect reoffending rates? Because the only way ultimately you're going to get the prison population down is if you reduce reoffending. And if instead of sending people to prison for short sentences, you actually deal with their drug or alcohol problem, or you give them the mental health treatment that you need, you might end up having a much bigger, longer-term effect than simply dealing with the numbers in the way that this review does. Similarly, if you have people who are better prepared for work, dealing with their educational problems while they're in prison because there is a little bit more space, because there aren't quite so many people overcrowded in the jails, then that's potentially going to have a longer-term impact.
So the proposal is to nearly abolish prison sentences under 12 months. So you think that's a great idea?
Yes. I mean, when you look at the reoffending rates, it's something like 2/3 of people who come out after those short sentences of less than 12 months go on to reoffend. Compare that to Norway, where it's 20%, where they have a much greater emphasis on rehabilitation. And those short sentences, all the experts say there's just no time to rehabilitate people. There's no time to deal with the problems they've got. Often they've committed crimes driven by an addiction or a mental health problem. You're not dealing with any of that if they're just churning through the system. I was doing the Times Crime and Justice Commission. There was a project in Birmingham. It was a repeat offender who was a drug addict. And he was stealing thousands and thousands of pounds a month to feed his drug habit. A policewoman had met him in the supermarket car park, put him on an intensive therapy course, treated the underlying problems. He hasn't committed a crime since. So rather than spiralling in and out of prison at huge cost to the taxpayer and huge cost to the retailers and huge cost to his family and himself, he was now on the straight and narrow.
But Rob, they did try this in Scotland, didn't they? Tried to abolish short prison sentences. But I've heard that hasn't worked that well.
I had a look at it. It's quite difficult to unpick the effect because the numbers were coming down a bit anyway. Then there was COVID. The most recent data shows that there's been a sort of uptick in these short sentences.
In Scotland?
Yeah,
despite a presumption against them?
So it may not work to produce the numbers. I think Gauke's estimate is that it might save 2,000 places. Well, that's a lot. The previous government were going to legislate to do a form of this, and they had more like 1,000. So there's then the question of, will some courts sentence people to just over the 12 months period to avoid this presumption? How many exceptions will there be? I mean, in the debate in the House of Commons when Shabana Mahmood made a statement, were a lot of interventions about domestic abuse and other particular kinds of offences, people who breach other kind of non-custodial orders and protection orders and so on, who are commonly punished with a short-term prison sentence. Will they fall into this presumption or won't they? So we'll have to wait and see when the legislation is published and the impact assessment, how all of these variables act together.
I think it does depend on how much the government's willing to invest in the community services as well to support people who aren't going to prison, because it's only going to work if you can give them the drug treatment, the alcohol treatment, the mental health support they need. I think technology now deals with a lot of the anxieties that people have, because you can pretty much track someone using GPS tags. Again, though, they have to make sure those are put on immediately. So that has to be properly delivered. But I think the idea of this sort of merry-go-round of in and out of prison is just not working, and particularly for women where you have high levels of mental health, often quite low-level offences. It's just cruel.
We all three totally agree about this. But what about the politics of it? Because the previous Conservative government was unhappy about this proposal. We have a completely new set of ministers in the Conservative Party. So how are the politics going to work now as far as the Tory party is concerned?
Well, I think in terms of the Tory party, they're not in government. So they can say what they like.
Can get headlines in newspapers if they're really unhappy about it. Do you think they're going to be unhappy about it?
Well, I think Robert Jenrick, who's the very hyperactive Shadow Justice Secretary, will do everything he can to accuse the government of being soft on crime. I think what the government has to do is make the argument about what's actually really tough on crime. Is it stopping people being criminals by dealing with their underlying problems, or is it sending people to prison and then turning them back into the community to commit more crimes?
You're preaching to the converted, Rachel. I just fear that the actual politics of it are going to be quite difficult in the end, partly because this government and Shabana Mahmood has shown in the row about the sentencing guidelines, which we've covered in this programme, that she seems quite cautious and fearful about the reaction of the press.
Well, I think she's right to be, because I think you have to land this with the public, but the politics of it are fascinating. So I spoke to Ken Clarke, who was Justice Secretary in the coalition government under David Cameron, and he'd actually drawn up a much more radical set of proposals, including scrapping all these minimum terms for sentences that had been introduced over years in Parliament. And he got it through the Cabinet Committee. He'd persuaded his Cabinet colleagues to do it. And then David Cameron found out about it, went absolutely ballistic, said, absolutely no way we're doing this. And he said to him, I thought you wanted a Liberal Justice Secretary. And David Cameron said words to the effect of, yes, of course I do, but I don't want anyone to notice. And there is that sense always of the politics that you can slip it through so long as it's not really high profile. But I think now this burning platform of the prisons crisis has created the opportunity for ministers to say, is this really what we as a country want to spend our money on? Do we really want to spend £10 billion on locking more people up? Or do we want to deal with their underlying causes, reduce crime, and have money to spend on schools, hospitals, winter fuel payments?
I agree. Rob, another major proposal, and we referred to it earlier, is to release prisoners earlier on this kind of earned release scheme. Can you simply explain how that would work?
Well, I'll have a go. I don't know about simply. So at the moment, most people who get prison sentences are released automatically after 40%. What David Gauke has said is that for most of those, they could be released after serving just a third if they earn that. Now, what he means by earn for most cases is they abide by the rules. There are some words in his report that suggests if they are offered things to do, such as education or treatment or work, they should be expected to take those opportunities up, and that can form part of the scheme for deciding whether they have earned their release. But obviously, we know prisons vary enormously in terms of what they can actually offer to people. A lot of people spend most of their time sitting in their cell. So I suspect the reality is most will qualify for getting out at the 1/3 point if they avoid getting into any serious trouble in the prison. Rachel, I don't know if that's your understanding of it.
Well, I think ideally the government would like it to be you have to fulfil education, work, treatment programs. I actually saw this system in operation in Spain, and I know David Gauke also visited the Spanish system. And it was really interesting because it gives prisoners an incentive to behave well and to do the programs that will earn them that earlier release. But the way they describe it, which I thought was really interesting, is the whole purpose of being in prison is to prepare for release and to get out. So rather than thinking we're keeping you here in this holding pen, they're thinking, what do we do to make you best prepared to go back into society as a better citizen than you came in and less likely to commit crime? And that completely changes the attitude of the prison officers, the attitude of the prisoners. And I met one woman, actually, she was serving quite a long sentence for fraud, and she spent her weekends out of prison working in a bakery. But she said there's absolutely no way she'd consider absconding when she's out for the weekend, because she knows that if she did, she'd be back at square one.
I can understand the theory. I suspect, Rob, that they actually have said it's about just obeying the rules because of the huge problem we've got at the moment, which is the availability of programs, education, workshops, etc. That if you said you have to do these extra things, there would be a kind of postcode lottery, wouldn't there?
There's that, plus the need to have a scheme that is procedurally fair to everybody. So the woman Rachel talks about had the opportunity to go out to the bakery. What if the woman in the next cell said, well, I'd have liked to have done that, but there was only one slot. So she's getting out, I'm not. And it needs to be relatively simple. We're talking about quite large numbers. They have these things called offender management units in prisons, which will be the people that decide whether you're getting out after a third or staying in. They need to have a system that's manageable and doable simply. Interestingly, Shabana Mahmood has decided that there shouldn't be an upper limit for release. So David Gauke said people could get out at the third point, they would get out at the halfway point, as is the norm. Shabana has said if people behave really badly, there's no upper limit. They can stay and spend the whole time. Now, I can see again why she's done that. It appears tough and it will appeal to many people. But I'd be interested to see what the estimates are. I mean, in her speech in the House of Commons, she talked about making the disciplinary system tougher than it is now. I doubt whether David Gauke's estimates took into account, a tougher system. So I think it's a juggling act, isn't it? On the one hand, needing to make this thing look hard, but also having to ensure that it does produce the savings in terms of prison places to stop the thing falling over again.
I mean, there is a slight challenge as well, which is the evidence that we have at the moment seems to indicate that the people who tend to get the disciplinary procedures are more likely to be black and brown than white. So there is also a slight risk that this whole early release scheme could suffer from what many see as discrimination.
I think there is that risk. It'll clearly need to be monitored very closely. And there's not a huge amount about discrimination in the report as a whole.
Frightened away by the whole
row.
Sentencing guidelines row.
Possibly so. David Gauke sort of played it into the idea he has right at the end of the report about setting up a kind of expert body to oversee and advise on criminal justice and sentencing. And I think he's probably pushed in their direction the things that he decided not to or didn't have the time to look at himself. And overrepresentation of minorities is one of those issues.
Rachel, you mentioned earlier on that doing community sentences instead of short prison sentences, people can kind of do more and the evidence is better in terms of reducing offending. But there's a big challenge here, isn't there? Which is those people need to be supervised in some way by the probation service.
Yeah, then they have to be not just highly qualified, but experienced people who can make the judgments. Because one of the things that's driven up the prison population is this very high recall population within prisons, people who've been sent back to jail, often for quite minor infractions of their licence when they're in the community. So
for getting drunk on the street or something.
We came across one case where the person had been sent back because he'd actually gone with his mum to A&E and he'd missed his appointment with the probation officer. Ended up back in prison for months or years.
Rob, how optimistic are you about probation meeting this challenge?
Well, I think it's usually put in terms of more probation officers. And yes, sure. But it's actually other practical things is housing. It is this kind of drug treatment which is under the health service. It's a much more multifaceted approach that's needed. It's not just the Ministry of Justice putting some budget into recruiting more probation officers. The best probation officers in the world aren't going to themselves be able to deal with a lot of the deep-seated problems. There's a lot in the report, actually, about what are now called intensive supervision courts. They used to be called problem-solving courts, but I think that was deemed to sound too soft. And it's the way that David Gauke has addressed this issue of very prolific offenders. And I mean tens or sometimes hundreds of offences, and often that is related to a drug addiction or an alcohol problem. Now, setting up these courts that is going to focus on those problems is one thing, but actually ensuring that they are able to plug those people in quickly to a service that they will engage with and it will start to have positive effects. That's a whole different ball game.
The intensive supervision courts, problem-solving courts, whatever we want to call them, I've read about them. They still rely on having probation officers.
You need a probation officer, but you need so much more, I think. And I'm not really sure that they've thought through the implications for the health service, for local authorities, for social work, for all these sort of specialist services, not just probation under the Ministry of Justice.
The thing that's interesting about the intensive supervision courts is you've got a judge personally following the progress of each of those offenders. I've sat in them both in the UK and in Texas. It was a really important aspect of the Texas prison reform program that really drove down the numbers. But as Rob says, it absolutely depends on having the facilities and the capacity to treat those offenders. But because you've got a judge involved, they have more power. They can order the NHS to provide a sort of alcohol or drug treatment for this individual. And I think that gives an extra authority, but you then have to have the capacity.
Rob, Rachel mentioned tagging, and in a way that I suppose that's the other part of the puzzle of how they get around the fact that probation is overstretched. That in terms of supervision, somebody who is being tagged is at least traceable. That was in the review as well, wasn't it? A sort of upweight of using that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's the idea of different levels of supervision for these people once they're out in stage 2 in the community after they spent their first third in prison. I mean, tagging has got a bit of a checkered history in this country so far. I mean, even now, the company that does it, Serco, has been fined every single month since it won the last contract in May last year for failing to meet its contractual targets.
For failing to put tags on time, basically.
That's one of the problems, yeah. So are they going to be in a position to kind of upscale quickly to be able to do all this? I hope so, because it's part of the picture, but it's not going to solve the problems on its own. It may enable people to take advantage of the kind of help and treatment that needs to be made available. But those are the bits that are going to do the trick, I think.
But it costs £54,000 a year to keep someone in prison, £8,000 on a tag. You know, we just can't keep going with locking everyone up. You've got to think of these alternatives. And I do think the technology has advanced enormously from the days when the tag had to be next to an enormous box. You know, now it's sort of GPS tracking. And there are also these alcohol tags now, which if somebody's got a requirement not to drink, they send an alarm if the person has had a drink. I spoke to James Timpson about it. He'd had to try it. He had to go and have 2 or 3 pints in the pub on whatever Wednesday afternoon. And apparently it does work.
I think they work. I mean, it's the element of the review where I have a certain scepticism, because the review kind of said it's all about, we want everything to be evidence-based. And, you know, alcohol tags, actually, the evidence base for them working in terms of reducing offending isn't that good. So my scepticism about something like that is they present it because it sounds good, which it does, but that we're not ready in terms of evidence to scale it right across the country. Rachel, we talked a bit about the politics of this and about how Robert Jenrick wants to give this government a hard time. presumably that means that this is not the end of what Rob and I have seen for the last sort of 15 years, which is a kind of political arms race between the two main political parties to be ever more punitive.
I think it might be the end of that arms race, actually, because I think what this review signals is that Labour isn't going to escalate that arms race. It may just flatten the curve, but it isn't going to keep ratcheting up that curve. And I think that's partly because of the economics of the thing. There is no money for anything. So for the Conservatives to go into the next election saying they want to spend, what are they going to say, £20 billion, £30 billion on new prisons? Where are they going to get that money? So I think the tables may start turning. And that's what happened in Texas, which I think has inspired Shabana Mahmood. It was a right-wing Republican governor in Texas, Rick Perry, who looked at the prison population projections. You know, he was going to have to spend billions of dollars on new prison places. And he just said, well, this is just a waste of taxpayers' money. And that's what started this whole program of the problem-solving courts, intensive drug treatment and therapy in the community. And they've ended up closing prisons, saving billions of dollars, brought the prison population down, far lower crime rates than there were. And when you talk to them, it was this combination of left and right, Democrats and Republicans coming at the problem from different angles. But it was the Republican governor who started this because it was a bad use of taxpayers' money. And I think that is a really compelling argument for Keir Starmer to make against Kemi Badenoch if she does come back and say, this is soft on crime, we need to send more people to prison. How's she going to pay for it?
Good point. Rob, obviously the politics in the USA have changed a lot. Republicans and Democrats have supported changes which have reduced their prison populations. Can you see that here?
Well, I don't know. We haven't really seen what Mr. Trump is going to do. He wants to reopen Alcatraz, doesn't he? Which doesn't sound like... He did
say that, yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, Rachel's talked about the Conservatives, and I'm sure she's right. I mean, Reform UK are a bit of a sort of outlier on this. Their last manifesto had some really tough stuff. You know, mandatory life sentence for repeat violent offenders. Totally unmanageable and unaffordable. If they get to the stage where they think perhaps they're going to play a part in having to govern, they may start to have to look at the figures more closely, and that may well moderate what they're doing. I'm not quite so optimistic as Rachel that the politics have gone out of it, much though I would love to see that.
Yes, indeed. And that's a good point to bring this discussion to an end, as we always do. Rob, if you were Lord Chancellor, what one thing would you do beyond what Gauke has proposed to reform our sentencing?
Well, one thing that has been kind of carved away from the sentencing review is this whole question of the role of the Sentencing Council. We've had this row about these guidelines on reports. I think the Sentencing Council does have a really important role to play in combating this sentence inflation. We can't have a situation in which sentences get longer and longer and longer, and people are serving smallish proportions of them. I don't think the public really understand that. It's not sustainable. So I think somebody, and I think the Sentencing Council, the people to do it, need to put a lid on the actual sentences, not just on the implementation of them.
Rachel, if you were Lord Chancellor and you could do one thing beyond Gauke's proposals, what would it be?
So I went to this brilliant place in Pennsylvania called Little Scandinavia, which is a wing of a traditional American prison, which they've based entirely on Scandinavian, Norwegian, Swedish prisons. So it's far more rehabilitative. They've got sort of cats and dogs wandering around, cappuccino makers, there's a Zen garden. But more importantly, there's a really serious emphasis on therapy and the relationship between the prison officer and the prisoner. And the whole focus is how do you prepare this person for their release? So if I were Lord Chancellor, I'd have a Little Scandinavia in every prison, one wing. They're doing it in 2 prisons now in London, Pentonville and Wandsworth. But I'd have those rolled out. Let's see if it works. In America, it's a randomized control trial So they randomly allocated the prisoners to this wing, and the rest of the prisoners run as a sort of traditional American jail. And the results are compelling. There's far less violence on the Little Scandinavia wing, much greater staff satisfaction, much less self-harm, greater mental health. And so far, when I went, nobody had reoffended, but it's early days. But I think bring a Little Scandinavia to every prison in Britain.
What about you, Penelope?
Well, I mean, there's so much, but I think I would have gone a bit higher on this short prison sentence thing. So the Prison Reform Trust suggested more or less abolishing any prison sentence up to 3 years. And I would certainly look at 2 years, as they do in many European countries, a basic suspension of any sentence under 2 years apart from particular circumstances, partly because the 12 months, as we've discussed, is numbers-wise not going to make much difference. But also, if you take somebody now who is sentenced to 2 years, under Gauke's proposals, they'll get out after a few months, which is like a short sentence yet again, which is useless. So I would have loved it if they'd gone a bit higher. But we need to draw it to a close. Thanks, both of you, so much. And if you'd like to read the actual report, we'll have a link to it in the programme notes, as we will also to the commission that Rachel chaired for the Times on crime and justice. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.